All right, everyone, let's get this party started. Welcome, class, to Classics 160 B1. Meet the Ancients! I, of course, am your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to be diving into the wild world of ancient Egypt. I know normally people are upset about class on Friday. Nobody wants to come to class on Friday. I don't want to teach class on Friday. But guys, this is ancient Egypt. This is the coolest stuff there is. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we got on the docket. We have got lecture, what is it? 2.2, The Gift of the Nile. All right, so let's see what we got coming up today. Announcements, of course, everybody's favorite part of class. Hopefully it's not everybody's favorite part of class. It's not a particularly exciting part of class, but important nonetheless. Then we're going to do a recap of the ancient Near East and the Bronze Age and why it's important, what some of the developments are, that sort of thing. And then we're going to take a dive. We're going to kind of move westward, we're going to move south, and we're going to move into the Nile River Valley as we take a look at Egypt. We'll have to see how timing goes here. If we're moving quickly, we'll just look at the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. If we're flying right along, we'll take the New Kingdom as well. We will play that as it goes. So let's see what we got on the docket for our announcements today. All right, so if you haven't done so already, put your screen in speaker view, please. That way you can see me, you can see the slides, you can see the words, you can take notes, you can see images, you can see everything that's important here. If you have a question during today's class where it's not kind of a moment when I'm asking for answers, please go ahead and send a message to your teaching assistant. All right, so they're all co-hosts. They can receive those. They'll answer them to the best of their ability, and they can forward any other ones to me. And again, it's not because I don't like talking to you guys, because I do. It's more just like I am terrible at multitasking, and then I get distracted from whatever I'm talking about and whatever. Okay. Bullet point number 3 is 80% true. If you're an honors student and you want to take this class for honors credit, check back 20 minutes after this class. Okay, so for real, honors students, I have written the assignment. It is ready to go. I just need to build the little folder on D2L and drop it in there. But the way that's going to work is there's going to be a folder under content that's just called Honors Project. You'll go there, you'll find a assignment sheet, and then what you'll do is you'll download that assignment sheet and you go to your honors webpage and upload it into the portal. So it's not an honors class. Anybody can be in this class, but the way it works is that if you're an honors student and you want honors credit for it, this is the project that you'll be working on. So check back a little bit after class, and it will be ready to go then. I promise, I wrote the thing, it's ready to go. I can't believe I didn't have it in the folder. This is what happens when you make the slides before you've actually done the work, you know? Let that be a life lesson to everyone. All right, what other announcements do we have? I don't know if anybody watched the Arizona basketball game yesterday. It was awesome. So Arizona State, we were up big early. We were down kind of big late. Good run at the end. Our guy misses a 3 with 2 seconds to go, but our other guy tips it in. And the guy who tipped it in, I don't want to take all the credit for this, but he took my ancient athletics class over the winter. And so, I mean, did that cause us to win the game? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's tough to tell. There's definitely a correlation, maybe causation. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But it was an awesome game, and if you haven't watched it, go check out the highlights on ESPN or Arizona's website or something along those lines. Okay, so let's go ahead, and what I want you guys to do is get your little chats ready. I'm going to ask you some questions now, just to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page. All right, so when it comes to learning dates for this class, I don't need super specific dates for the most part, all right? But I do want these kind of very broad, rough dates. And the reason for that is I want you guys to be able to get a relative sense for how quickly, right, the developments that we have and that we're talking about in this class actually occur in the big scheme of things, all right? So I'm going to ask you a few questions here. Throw me some answers in the chat, and I will see who gets the answers first. All right, first question. How old is the universe according to astrophysicists here at the University of Arizona? 13 billion, 14 billion, 13.7. Oh man, that's a lot of answers. Yes, somewhere between 13 and 14 billion years old. 13 and 14 billion with a B. It's really stinking old, okay? And again, they trace this through the expansion rate and this thing that we call background radiation that exists more or less anywhere where astrophysicists or astronomers point their telescope. Okay, how about the Earth? How old? Man, somebody was on that one quick. Yeah, about 4.5 billion years old. Again, when it starts out, it is not a particularly hospitable place. Although life arises relatively quickly, it's still millions, it's actually still billions of years until life gets relatively complex. So let's fast forward a little bit more. I thought I had that slide was out of order. We'll come back to that slide. Yeah. All right. Modern humans. I got to get my slides in order. Okay. All right. So modern humans, the answer's on the slide. 200,000 years old, right? According to biological anthropologists. Those are the guys. Those are the people who study early humans and our kind of non-human primate ancestors. Now, for the first 190,000 years, humans all over the world do relatively similar things, right? They go try to hunt woolly mammoths so they can eat. They try to procreate with the people next door, and they try to not get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Now, about 12,000 years ago, right, about 10,000 BC, we get something that we call the Neolithic Revolution. And can anybody tell me what are the main characteristics of the Neolithic Revolution? All right, so we've got settling down, we've got farming, right, growing crops, very good, and domestication of animals, right? Those are the three big things: settling down, farming, and domestication. And it makes sense, right? This is a time at the end of the Ice Age. Things are getting warmer, the climate is improving, the population is growing, and all of a sudden, when you go to hunt your woolly mammoth next door, somebody's already there. There are already people there. You can't have that woolly mammoth anymore. And eventually, people decide, hey, maybe I'll just start adding a little bit of water to my crops and using those to feed myself and my family and the group of people. Now, why is this such a big deal? Can you guys try to put in a sentence or two or three, something relatively short in the chat? Farming doesn't seem that exciting. Why was I harping on this so much last time in terms of setting off a cycle that I feel like continues in the world today? All right, so we got stability, food stability, right? Food surplus, food stability. What does that lead to? Yep, population growth, very good. So now we've got surplus, and then we've got stability, and then we've got more people. And now that we've got more people, what can happen? Specialization, that's exactly right? You can have labor specialization. A couple people in your group can do things other than produce food. And what do they do other than produce food? That's exactly right? They work on other things, right? They're like, oh, maybe I'll invent the wheel. Or how about build some tools, right? There are a lot of different things that come out over the course of this time that end up producing more food. And then the cycle starts again, right? Food leads to stability, leads to more people, leads to specialization, leads to technology, leads to more food, and on and on and on in this positive feedback loop. Now, with the Neolithic, right, even though population's growing and people are settling down, everybody's still kind of sort of living a similar life. When you look at the archaeological remains and you look at things like houses and the different sites that exist, they all look kind of similar, right? Everybody's house is more or less the same. The stuff in the house is more or less the same. There aren't really large buildings other than kind of houses that people are living in. And that all begins to change in the Bronze Age. Let's go back over here. All right, so the Bronze Age is the main period that we were talking about last time. Can somebody start by giving me a rough date for the beginning of the Bronze Age? That's exactly right, around 3000 BC, okay? So about 5,000 years ago. Now remember, put this in the context of what we've been talking about. We're going from 13.7 billion years to around 200,000 years ago for humans to like, when we're going to talk about all this complexity, it's starting like 5,000 years ago, right? I know that sounds kind of far. That is like a drop in the bucket in terms of the big scheme of human and universal history. Okay, so it starts around 3000 BC. And where does this occur? Where do the kind of major developments of the Bronze Age occur earliest? All right, Mesopotamia, right? That's the Greek word for the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then also where we're going to talk about today, right? So Egypt, centered on the Nile River Valley. All right, and what were some of the major developments of the Bronze Age, right? All right, so we've got urbanization, right? People are now living in cities. And one of the big differences between cities and what we saw with the Neolithic was that these cities end up having different types of architecture, right? All of a sudden, it's not just houses anymore. It's a wide variety of different things. Good. Political hierarchies, right? Which eventually lead to hereditary rule. Along with that, we've got religious hierarchies and priesthoods. How does that occur? How do people like end up becoming political leaders? Any idea? Yeah, so it kind of begins with project organization, right? And so the way that this ends up working is that for large-scale projects like irrigation or later on monumental architecture, you need to have somebody doing the planning and somebody doing the working. And those planners, right, the people who organize the labor eventually become the kind of political elite. And then later on, they justify that ability to rule through some sort of special access to the gods. They say the gods have chosen them to rule, or that they're actually indeed descended from the gods. Very good. We also get some different technology. What type of technology arises during this time? We get the wheel. Very good. We get what sort of metal? Bronze, that's right. We get a chariot towards the later end of the period. Iron ends up coming up later, like kind of at the very end of the Bronze Age, we start to get iron, especially with the Hittites. Writing is a big one, right? And we talked about writing kind of as essentially just as important as something like settling down and farming, right? In large part because out of all these things, writing is one of those that has this, or kind of initiates this feedback loop where you can all of a sudden start conveying knowledge to future generations that you don't have to keep inside your head. All right, very good. So we talked about the Bronze Age in one particular part of the world, right? We talked about Mesopotamia, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in much of what is modern day Iraq, all right? And one of the things that ends up happening here that's going to differentiate it from Egypt is that you get different groups of people subsequently taking over the region, okay? And so you start with the Sumerians. Anybody remember who comes after the Sumerians? That's right, the Akkadians. And if you had to know one Akkadian, who is the Akkadian to remember? That's right, Sargon the Great, right? He is remembered for thousands of years afterwards as like one of the world's greatest conquerors. And keep in mind, right, this isn't like the modern world where you just like type his accomplishments into a computer. Somebody was like repeatedly chiseling down, right, in cuneiform tablets or inscriptions on walls, the accomplishments of somebody like Sargon. After that, we get the Babylonians taking over. And anybody remember the kind of major Babylonian dude to remember? Yeah, we got Hammurabi, and we keep like that guy in mind because of what? What did he do? Yeah, it's the institution of a formalized legal code. All right? And this is really important because it makes everybody play by the rules that have been written down. Now, the traditional interpretation of that is an eye for an eye, right? And we saw last time that that's not really the case. It's not really an eye for an eye. However, the fact that it's written down is still really, really important, even for those lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. All right, now at the end of last time, we saw the kind of late Bronze Age group known as the Hittites, all right? And we can see over here that the Hittites are based in modern-day Turkey, in what we call Anatolia there. And then we've also got Egypt down here, right? That's what we're going to talk about today. And eventually they end up bumping into each other. And this is a difficult battle, all right? So the Hittites came to play. They are a very warlike people. They are the inventors of the chariot, all right? They are the first to start using iron weapons, and that ends up being very important because those are stronger and less likely to bend and break than bronze weapons. And they are very, very effective in battle. And what I had you guys do for today, right, was read the ancient accounts of the Battle of Kadesh. Okay, so this is towards the end of the Bronze Age. And we've got this battle between the Hittites coming down from modern-day Turkey and the Egyptians coming up from modern-day Egypt, obviously, and clashing somewhere in the middle in what we'd call the Levant, in the region of modern-day Syria. Okay, so this is happening towards the end of the Bronze Age. It's really important for a couple reasons. One, it's the first battle in history where we have a play-by-play of what's going on, right? If you read the thing, it's hard to pick out. It's really hard. And so I really appreciate your attempts at doing so. But you can get a sense for where troops were moving and the order of events that ended up occurring. Second, it's the world's first major chariot battle, right? So in the centuries since the Hittites invented it, Egypt was able to latch onto this technology, and they had the chariot for their own purposes, and so chariots were on both sides. And then as you guys read for today, one of the super cool things is that both sides recorded the battle. Excuse me. Oh, and the final reason it's super cool, if you read to the very, very end, in addition to having the Egyptian account, which is a lot more detailed, and a brief version of the Hittite account, we also have the peace treaty. This is super cool. We have like the peace treaty. And you know, who actually won this or who it was more beneficial for, there is no like perfect answer to that, right? You guys can determine that on your own. However, the treaty says that the boundary between Hittite power and Egyptian power is going to stay exactly where it was. So some people would say that this is actually a draw in the sense that no one of these groups was able to really push the other one out of the region. So what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into Egypt, and we're going to see how we get to this point. In Egyptian history, this is taking place during what's called the New Kingdom, all right? And my guess is we'll probably tackle that on Monday. Like, Egypt is so cool that you don't want to rush things when you're going through Egypt. So we'll probably get to that on Monday. But we'll see what happens in this region leading up to the New Kingdom today. Okay, so let's take a look at Egypt, the gift of the Nile. This term, if you've ever heard it before, it was coined by the Greek historian Herodotus. And Herodotus is sometimes known as the father of history. He's frequently known for coming up with the very, very embellished tales of what's going on historically. If you read him, he's a super fun read because his stories are just bonkers, right? He'll talk about magic rings being found and all kinds of stories about history of not just Greece, but the surrounding region. But one thing he did get right, when he called Egypt the gift of the Nile, that could not be more true. Everything in Egypt is the result of this super productive, beneficial, agriculturally productive river. All right. Why is this over here? I don't know where those slides came through. Let's check this real quick. Okay. All right. There we go. Apologies for the not missing slides, the extraneous slides in the middle there. I hope that didn't distract you. Egypt is one of these places that has held the attention and allure of societies throughout history. Like I was saying, Herodotus, right, is fascinated by Egypt. He calls Egypt the gift of the Nile. When we get to ancient Rome, Rome finds Egypt incredibly fascinating. They get so taken with Egypt that elite people in Rome start building pyramids as tombs for themselves. They get so into it that they start taking obelisks from Egypt, right? And actually bringing them into the city of Rome. And then later on, they start building their own obelisks. And one of the really hilarious things is they so they know that hieroglyphs are writing, but they don't really know how to translate them or to write with them. So they just make up hieroglyphs as though it were writing to kind of make it look Egyptian. And so just a super interesting thing in the sense that we're fascinated with Egypt today. This goes way, way back into history. Okay, now a couple things to keep in mind when we're looking at Egyptian history. The first thing is that we break Egyptian history up into a couple different kind of categories. So you'll frequently hear the word dynasty, and what a dynasty refers to is a series of rulers from the same family, all right? And there are 31 of these in ancient Egypt. And when we say ancient Egypt, it spans around 3,000 years, from around 3000 BC to around the 1st century BC when Rome takes over. Okay, so dynasties, that's a family of rulers. Now, we group dynasties into what we call kingdoms. And kingdoms are these larger periods of very strong, centralized rule, right? So if you're in a kingdom, the government is strong, it's doing well, it's exerting authority over a large area, it's able to keep any sort of invasion at bay. There's a lot of building projects, those kind of things. And those are contrasted with what we call intermediate periods, right? And this is essentially the opposite. So groups of dynasties that have relatively weak governments. The power of the pharaoh is relatively limited. And kind of you're getting a lot of invasions from the outside. Now, this kind of system, part of it with the kingdoms is actually more modern. But the idea of dynasties, the idea of grouping Egyptian history into dynasties based on families of rulers, actually is ancient to begin with. So this guy Manetho, in the 200s BC, ends up writing this story, this Egyptiaca, this history of Egypt, where he's the one to first group them into these dynasties here. All right, so keep that in mind. Dynasties, a family of rulers; kingdoms, groups of dynasties of strong centralized rule; and then intermediate periods, the opposite of that, right? Groups of dynasties that are weak in terms of centralized political government. All right, so when we take a look at Egypt, right, we've got a Google satellite photo over here, and we've got more of a regular map over here. The first thing to keep in mind is that you can kind of see just how influential the Nile is. Where the Nile flows, things are extremely fertile. And where the Nile doesn't flow, it kind of transitions to desert very, very quickly. If you ever have the chance to go to Egypt today, it's still like that. When you're in the Nile Valley, the soil is a dark, dark black up until the irrigation stops, and then it turns into desert immediately. And in ancient Egyptian language, they had terms for both of these areas. So they called the kind of fertile area up here and in the Nile Valley, they called it Kemet, known as the Black Land, based on the color of the soil, the really, really rich, productive soil. And they called the desert, right, Desret, or the Red Land. And this is one of the very, very, very few words that we actually have in modern English that stems from ancient Egyptian language, right? So we get tons of words from Greek and Latin and stuff like that. One of the very few ones that we get from ancient Egyptian is our word for desert, which they called Desret, which means the red land, based on the color of the desert itself. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing is that when we're looking at this, we're looking at a couple different regions, right? So we've got the delta up here, right? So this is where the Nile kind of flows outward into a bunch of different little branches towards the Mediterranean Sea. And they call it the delta, actually. This is a Greek term here, because it's triangular, which is the same shape as the Greek letter delta, right? So that's why the delta is called the delta. And then the rest of it's the Nile River Valley. And when we map names onto this, we call this area around the delta, we call that Lower Egypt. And we call this area, right, way down in the south over here, Upper Egypt. And this is very confusing to begin with, okay? So it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? That the stuff up top is known as Lower Egypt and the stuff down below is Upper Egypt. Anybody know why that's the case? Yeah, it's not so much elevation, it's actually the flow of the river itself, which I guess is kind of actually due to elevation. So you're right with elevation as well. The river flows from south to north, right? So it starts way down here, right off the map, and then flows northward into the Mediterranean. And so because of that, right, it's lower because this is more towards the outlet of the river, and then this is upriver down here. You can also see that this is very, very good for the natural defenses of Egypt, right? So, I mean, it's a pain in the butt to try to attack Egypt. If you're coming in from like the northeast, like as the Hittites or something, you've got to cross all this desert just to get there, right? If you're coming in from the south, more desert. Coming in from the west, more desert. Coming in from the north, you've got the Mediterranean Sea here. And one of the difficulties is even though the river flows all the way to the Mediterranean, the little branches of the river are very small in here, right? So you can't sail from here all the way up the Nile particularly easily. Now, in the earliest days of Egypt, think a little bit before 3000 BC, right? 3000 is that kind of start of the Bronze Age. In the centuries just before that, Egypt was kind of grouped into two different regions, right? So we've got Lower Egypt here in the north. We've got Upper Egypt down here in the south. And these regions had different political rulers, okay? And we can tell that because the earliest archaeological artifacts that show some sort of centralized rule have different iconography of the crowns of the rulers. So the earliest rulers in the north, they have this red crown, what's known as the red crown, and it's got the little curly Q on there, all right? And the rulers in the south, right, the earliest rulers in the south, they have what I call the bowling pin crown, all right? And then what ends up happening right around 3000 BC is we get our first depiction archaeologically of a king wearing both of the crowns, right? The double crown that has both the red crown and the curly Q and the white bowling pin crown. And what archaeologists and Egyptologists think is happening there, right, is the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single political power. Now, before that happens, what you're looking at over here is one of these really important artifacts in the days just before unification. And what we end up seeing, this is known as the scorpion mace head. If you ever heard of the movie The Scorpion King, it's actually based on a real dude, right? So we call this guy the Scorpion King. A mace is a weapon that you use for like bashing people over the skull with. In this case, it's a ceremonial one. That's probably not for real bashing. It's more for display by a king. But you see the king here. Here's a drawing of it. He's much larger than everybody else. If you can see over there, he's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And it's a little hard to see, but right next to him is this scorpion, all right? And so that's why we call him King Scorpion, or the Scorpion King. And what he's holding, all right, in his hand here is a spade, right? Or a hoe, like an implement for digging a ditch. And so what's being represented here is the king presiding over some sort of irrigation process. And that's why when we go back to, what actually facilitated the kind of advent of political hierarchy and complexity, we look at projects like irrigation as a key force in driving that political change. All right, so the Scorpion King, but we think he was just king in Upper Egypt again because he's only portrayed with one of the crowns. All right, now, next up, we've got one of the most important artifacts in terms of unification of Egypt. It's called the Narmer Palette. And what a palette is, all right, it's like a thing you use for like grinding minerals, right? And the way that people made makeup in ancient times is they grind up minerals, right? Like little iron ore or something like that to get something red. They'd grind up like, I don't know, lapis or something to get blue. And you grind it into a powder and then you put it on your eyes or wherever you want to put it. But again, this is a ceremonial one owned by the king. And what we see is we see the king portrayed with both crowns. So on one side, he's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And on the back here, he's wearing the red crown. And what we think is that this is some of the first evidence we've got for a unified Egypt, for Upper and Lower Egypt coming together. So let's go ahead and take just kind of a closer look, just because this artifact is super cool here, right? So on the one side, we see the king, again, bigger than everybody else, holding a mace, right? That's like what the scorpion mace head would have looked like when it was actually attached to a weapon. And he's about to bash somebody over the head. Now he's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. The hawk here is the symbol of Horus, who's the god of kingship. And he's subjugated somebody down here who's kind of a stylized person something or other, right? And he's got these things growing out of his back. And what those are papyrus reeds growing out, which are frequently grow in the Nile Delta. And because these grow in the Delta, that area up in the north, what we think we're viewing here is a depiction of kind of the symbol of kingship in Upper Egypt, having subjugated Lower Egypt in the Delta. And we can see it in a couple different ways. And then on the back, what we've got is we've got the same king now, but wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, like he's taking it over. And then we see these two kind of mythical beasts down here that actually form the area where you'd grind the makeup. And people argue that it's kind of the intertwining of those is like the intertwining of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the kind of unification of those two. So up here, you can see the hawk or the falcon is the symbol of Horus there. Yeah. And up here you can see the hieroglyphs for the guy's name, his name is Narmer. Nope, going the wrong direction. There we go. Okay, so after Narmer, we get into actually dynastic Egypt, right? Some people would say that Narmer is one of the first kings of the first dynasty. And what we see is fairly quickly, kings are able to exert control over a pretty wide range of people and geographical area. And what we're looking at is a first dynasty tomb, the Tomb of Den. And this is just after the unification. This is within like 100 years. And what we end up seeing is the king would have been buried in the center here. And all around the outside, these are subsidiary tombs. And there are people buried in here that look like they've been basically sacrificed. And so in the earliest days of kingship, what some people argue, right, is that when the king dies, he would actually take all of his servants with him to the afterlife, right, to serve him in the afterlife. Now, you can imagine how that affected the number of job applications for servant to the king. It can't have been a very desirable job if you knew that you had to die when the king died. And as a result, what we see relatively early is a transformation from actual servants being sacrificed to symbols of servants that will then serve the king in the afterworld. And these are known as ushabtis. All right, so these little figurines that look like people. And the goal here is that they actually replace the actual person, the actual servant. But the large numbers of these would be buried with royalty in the afterlife, and then they would come to life and serve the king in the afterlife. So kind of a clever way to get around the idea that hundreds of people had to be killed every time the king died. Okay, so that's some of the crazy stuff going on in what we call the early dynastic period, right? Dynasties 1 and 2. From now on, we're moving into the Old Kingdom. All right, so the Old Kingdom is the age of the pyramids. And this is crazy. So next week, we're going to get into the Bronze Age Aegean, and you're going to see some palaces and stuff like that. All the pyramids we're looking at here, this all happens 1,000 years before anything really gets going in Greece. The time scale of this, the sheer oldness of the pyramids and the scale of their structure is incredible compared to what else is going on in the Mediterranean during this same time. In Greece, what you'll end up seeing, the biggest thing at this time when the pyramids are being built is like kind of a big house with a nice tile roof. They call it the House of the Tiles. It's not a very creative name. In Egypt, you get a massive sphinx and pyramids. It's incredible. Now, when we look at the pyramids, what we're looking at is we're looking at tombs for the pharaohs, okay? And what we can see is in the Old Kingdom, we can actually visualize the evolution of these things, all right? So it starts off in the early dynastic period with what's known as a mastaba tomb. So that's what we're looking at here. And a mastaba tomb is a symbol of the primordial mound, which in Egyptian religion, this is the thing from which all life arose. By Dynasty 3, we get the pharaoh Djoser, who decides to take one mastaba and then stack another one on top, and another one on top, and another one on top. And I think, what do we have there? 1, 2, 3, 4. I think he's got 6 layers. And we've got the world's first pyramid. It's a step pyramid. And in the next dynasty, we've got the pharaoh Snefru, who decides he's going to flatten out the sides and try to build the world's first true pyramid. And the thing is, apparently it's kind of hard to build a true pyramid. So his first one, he gets about halfway done, and the architect realizes it's not going to work. He has to change the angle and make it less steep. We creatively call it the bent pyramid. The next one, he builds it up, and then it collapses on itself. And then finally he does actually get a true pyramid. But only about 100 years later, 50 to 100 years later, we've got the pinnacle of pyramid building with the Great Pyramid. All right, so this happens at Giza. What I want to do right now is let's go ahead and do attendance. I'm going to jump through and give you the attendance for today, and then we'll come back and talk about the pyramids. Where's our attendance? Okay, there's our attendance. Attendance quiz 2. Heracles is looking green today. I don't know if he's not feeling well or what the deal is, but go ahead, get on D2L and go to quiz 2, January 22nd, and choose green. And once you've done that, I'll give you a minute here, and then we'll pop back to talk about the Great Pyramid, and we'll pick up with the Middle and New Kingdom on Monday.
Dr. Rob, I have an interesting question from a student. This is Blake.
Oh, yeah.
Baron wants to know, are any of the old and or first attempted pyramids still around?
Yeah, so you can go, the first pyramid we've got is that step pyramid at the site of Saqqara. So I'm going to go back to that. Remember, green is the answer for today. Go ahead and put in green. Where are we with our evolution? There we go. So this is the earliest one we got, and you can go visit it today. They actually just did renovations on this thing. And one of the cool things is it's not just the pyramid, but the whole complex is pretty well preserved. And so all of these are still standing today. And again, the crazy thing is that it's just, these are so old. Think about it. By the time of the Battle of Kadesh, right, what you read for today, these pyramids had been around for 1,300 years, right? That puts us, from our period now, that put us back in the early medieval period. It's wild. There was a good question in the chat here. If you're seeing the word dropped next to your assignment or your quiz, even though you got the question right, what that is the way this is set up is you automatically will have your 6 lowest scores dropped, okay? And so right now, because you've only done 2 of these, even though you've gotten 100% on of them, they're your 2 lowest scores. And what's gonna happen is at the end of the semester, if you're missing any, if you didn't come to class for whatever reason, it's fine. Those will turn into zeros, and then the zeros will get dropped. So don't worry about that. Okay. Another good question about, I'll talk more about this actually on Monday about kind of reconstructing these things. And there's a couple different debates that are going on about the best way to do that. Right now, archaeologists actually think that it's good to kind of differentiate what's actually ancient from kind of the reconstructed part. So to try to not make it look totally seamless, but there's debate about that. Anyway, pyramids of Giza. All right, so Giza is up in Lower Egypt in the north. So this is right here, right? It's right where the kind of Nile Valley meets the Nile Delta up here. And this is the site of the Great Pyramid. Now, this is where you're going to, this is kind of one of the most famous angles to take the picture from when you go to Giza. It looks like this is the Great Pyramid here. The Great Pyramid's actually this one. It's actually bigger. It's just like, because of the perspective, it looks a little bit smaller. You can always tell that this is the pyramid of a guy named Khafre, the successor to Khufu, because it's still got the fine limestone casing at the top. And anyway, the important thing to remember here, right? These are tombs for the deceased. And as a tomb, it's part of a much larger complex that includes temples, it includes burials for the queens, right? Smaller pyramids. It includes burials for a lot of the kind of high elite, kind of politicians that are below the king. There's also a workers' cemetery down here. Because somebody actually had to build these things. So the pyramid is just one part of a much larger complex. Oh, a question about the dates. Oh, yeah, so this is like when we have these dates up here, this is just kind of a range for when we think these things were built. Somewhere in that kind of range. Remember, there are 3 pyramids actually built during this time here. But again, date-wise, if you know that the pyramids are built in the middle of the 2000s BC, the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, that you're good there. All right, so the Great Pyramid, this is more than 400 feet high. It belonged to the 4th century ruler by the name of Khufu, all right? It covers 13 acres at the base, and it's the earliest of the pyramids at Giza. The earliest one there is actually the biggest and best. And when you kind of look at it in comparison to other sorts of architecture, the pyramid was the largest building in the world for nearly 4,000 years. Like, think about that. Almost 4,000 years after this thing is built, it's still the tallest structure in the world. Absolutely incredible. Now, on the inside, right, most of it is solid, but you get a couple different areas that eventually lead to the king's burial chamber in there. The most impressive of those is known as the Grand Gallery. And so this is a corbelled vault, so stones increasingly placed closer to each other. It gets kind of narrower and narrower towards the top, where you have a flat stone at the top. And once you get through that, you get to the burial chamber. So we've got both the king and the queen's burial chamber here. And that's where the body would have been. Now, when archaeologists got in there, there was no body. It had been looted by then. That's where the burial would have taken place. All right, so hang with me for 30 more seconds here, and we'll wrap it up for today. The Old Kingdom comes to an end, in large part because one guy rules for so long that all of his successors die before he actually dies. And as a result, kind of local power, regional power, ends up growing, and eventually this leads into the fall of the Old Kingdom. So we'll talk about the New Kingdom on Monday. And in doing so, we'll talk about Osiris and some of the religion associated with the Egyptians, and how that also leads into the process of mummification. So again, you don't need to write anything down about that right now. We'll talk about it more on Monday. So let's go ahead and we'll wrap it up. For Monday, you don't have to write anything. Go ahead and start looking at the reading for next week. Great start to the class, guys. You guys are doing a fabulous job. We'll have your reading responses back by Tuesday, so that you can get some feedback prior to when they're due next Friday. Have a great weekend, and I will see you back here on Monday. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good one.